What would happen to the global economy if 10 countries from Southeast Asia decided to create their own currency? Could they create the third reserve currency of the world? Or will they face the same problems the EU has had with the euro? ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is made up of 10 states in, you guessed it, Southeast Asia. While its predecessor, the Association of Southeast Asia, or ASA, was formed in July 1961, the current ASEAN was established on August 8, 1967, 6 years later. Brunei, Burma, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam put together have a population of 655 million people. The combined purchasing power parity (GDP) of these 10 nations measured $10.2 trillion in 2022, which is 6.5% of the world's GDP. ASEAN countries have a striking advantage over other associations of its kind because they represent some of the fastest growing economies of the world. Following the example of the European Union and the euro, the ASEAN countries started talking about developing a centralized currency that is supposed to smash that like button, just like you should if you haven't done so already. But no, in all seriousness, the currency is supposed to help these countries grow economically and make trading between them much easier. However, experts are questioning whether or not the ASEAN members are ready for a single currency. Here's why. Before the euro became a global currency, something called the European Currency Unit, or ECU, was introduced. The ECU became operational on March 13, 1979, and it was part of the largest European Monetary System, or EMS. So what were these ECUs, and why were they so important? Back then, every EU country had its own currency. Italy operated the lira, France had the franc, and Germany had the German mark. When the unit of account was introduced, the country's budgets and spending were dominated in ECUs. All the currencies from the member states were fixed to the ECU within adjustable bands. While the French franc was fixed with a 2.5% band, the Italian lira was fixed with a slightly higher 6% band. Then, in 1983, France introduced the idea of a centralized currency. It took some time for the proposal to be accepted. After the Maastricht Treaty in 1991, they announced that by 1999, there would be a new currency. On January 1, 1999, the euro was finally introduced as the EU's official new currency. But why tell you all this? Well, simply because something similar is happening, or should happen, in the ASEAN countries. The leaders of the member states, wanting to lessen their dependency on US dollars while promoting free financial trade among its members, proposed the creation of the ACU. The Asian Development Bank, or ADB, working closely with Japan's Research Institute on Economy, Trade, and Industry, was tasked with creating a basket for the currencies of 13 Asian countries, including South Korea, China, and Japan. And the logic behind ACU is pretty straightforward. If the ADB creates a basked ACU, then the central banks in those countries will begin to stabilize their national currencies in relation to the ACU. This way, there are fewer competitive devaluations. This was a major problem between France and Germany in the past, and it seems to be a problem for the ASEAN countries as well. In short, when one country devalues its own currency, the other countries strategically devalue their own currency in response. There are only two ways to stabilize a currency. First, the ASEAN countries can peg their currencies to an external currency, such as the US dollar, the euro, the yen, or the yuan. However, since ASEAN countries want to move away from the dollar and the euro, they could only peg them to either the yen or the yuan. However, that might be easier said than done. Sure, China and Japan's currencies are extremely important for East Asia, but we can't forget that Japan's lost decade weakened their currency, and the yen is no longer a viable option. They could go with China's yuan, which is backed up by the country's strong economic growth. But here's the problem. The yuan is not fully convertible when it comes to international deals. So when it comes to clearance, financing, and liquidity, holding this might be a problem. So now we're left with option number 2. stabilize the currencies of the member states following the example of Europe's exchange rate mechanism. This would require the creation of an internal basket of currencies and the introduction of a new currency. Then, similar to how EU member states had a predetermined rate of exchange of their local currencies to euros, so could the ASEAN members tie their currencies to a new Asian currency. But introducing a new currency is easier said than done. When discussing the introduction of a new currency, the first thing we have to talk about is the region's readiness to adopt that new currency. Some experts suggest that the benefits of a common currency outweigh the costs. First off, when creating a new economy, countries will have to give up some of their authority and independence when it comes to their monetary policy. That being said, since most of the member states have a mixed track record of conducting a successful monetary policy, surrendering independence to a credible regional central bank might be better. Second, we need to look at the labor mobility, how easy it is for workers of one country to find a job in a different member country, and capital mobility. Can you easily invest capital in a different country? Both labor and capital mobility seem to be on par with EU nations when they signed the Maastricht Treaty in 1991. Just consider that 10% of Singapore's employment includes workers from Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. Third, do ASEAN members have high wage and price flexibility? In other words, how easily do they adjust to economic shocks? According to a 1994 study, after experiencing such a shock, most of the changes in price and output happened in the first 2 years following the shock. This means that the labor market is flexible and can absorb the shock of introducing a new currency. And fourth, the trade to GDP ratios and the trade intensity ratios in the ASEAN countries were higher than they are in Western Europe. For example, intra-regional trade in ASEAN total trade is about 25%. While it might not be as high as the EU's intra-regional trade of 40%, it's still significant and on the rise, especially when you consider that there are currency unions out there, like the Central African Economic and Monetary Community, whose intra-regional trade is only 3%. So if we take into account wage price flexibility, labor mobility, intra-regional trade, and shock symmetry, then we can see that the ASEAN countries are in a similar position as their Western counterparts. Clearly, ASEAN is ready to introduce a new currency, right? Even though ASEAN members are ready to adopt a new currency based on the empirical data we gave earlier, adopting a new common currency and sustaining a new common currency are two different things. As Ike Green said in a 2014 article, the absence of a common fiscal policy could lead to tensions among member countries. That's why economists warn against 4 major constraints for adopting a new currency. First is the diversity in the level of economic development across countries, and in the ASEAN countries, that economic diversity is pretty huge. If we take the per capita income of Singapore, ASEAN's richest country, and compare it to that of Myanmar, the poorest ASEAN country, there's a 300x difference. Even if we take the top 5 ASEAN countries and compare their per capita income, we still see some major differences. Singapore's per capita income is 40 times that of Indonesia's. Members of the EU don't have such high disparities. Maintaining a new currency in a union with such high diversity is problematic at best and impossible at worst. The second constraint includes weaknesses in the financial sectors of many countries. We have clearly learned that countries with weak financial sectors that rely on foreign investments experience exchange rate crises when they peg their exchange rates. Who will maintain the common currency arrangements if the banks fail at the first sign of trouble? Although the ASEAN countries have not shown problems in their banking sectors, the 1997 crisis showed the world just how fragile these banking institutions can be. So before a new currency is introduced, ASEAN members need to make major banking reforms. The third constraint is the inadequacy of region-level resource pooling mechanisms and institutions required for forming and managing a currency union. Now, having enough regional reserve pooling and the lack of regional institutions places a toll on sustaining a common currency for ASEAN countries. They have addressed this constraint by signing the Chiang Mai Initiative. But that's just the beginning. The EU members shared several large institutions, like the European Council, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank. They were responsible for managing and coordinating regional resources, and they are successful because they were followed by decades of experimentation. If ASEAN seeks to introduce a new currency, they should learn from the failed test of their EU counterparts and speed up the creation of these institutions. Finally, the lack of political precognitions of monetary cooperation and a common currency is another major constraint. Simply put, if the talks about monetary integration are not paired with debates about political integration, then this system is going to be very fragile. There needs to be a supranational entity that will have the power to override the member governments. By doing so, the power shifts from the individual governments to the collective entities. While the 2020 ASEAN Banking Integration Framework seems to be a step in the right direction, there's a lot of work to be done here. If ASEAN manages to address these constraints, then they have a chance at creating a new common currency that facilitates trade, decreases transaction costs, reduces currency risk, and severs the organization's reliability on the dollar. This would lead to a tighter economic integration of the region as business activities increase.